My name is Sam Chachkis. I'm the Brown University Democrat Speaker and Events Director. I want to thank the Watson Institute one more time for organizing this and allowing me to help moderate. We're thrilled to host Brown University alum Mike Zamore for a conversation about his book, Filibustered, co-authored by Senator Jeff Merkley. Mr. Zamore, with his over 22 years of experience working on the Hill and an impressive 14 years as the Chief of Staff to U.S. Senator Jeff Merkley under his belt, is a distinguished authority on all things United States Senate. Mr. Zamore drew on that experience in writing Filibustered, which details the genesis, initial nature, and subsequent transformation of the filibuster as practice in the United States Senate. Filibustered introduces an argument in favor of nuanced filibuster reform. Now, the filibuster, a United States Senate parliamentary procedure, was a concept introduced in the early days of our democracy to protect minority rights. The filibuster was first employed in earnest in 1841, and its use has accelerated in frequency since then. In response to that trend and the legislative blockage it produced, the Senate in 1917 adopted Rule 22, creating the cloture motion, which would allow the closure of a filibuster with a 2/3 majority among senators. That rule was amended in 1975 to allow the invocation of cloture at a 3/5 rather than 2/3 majority. Also in 1975, the non-speaking filibuster was introduced, a reform that led, unfortunately, to its increased use. The contemporary filibuster is a source of great democratic pain, producing often paralyzing legislative gridlock in our Senate. Mr. Zamore and Senator Merkley understand that the filibuster cannot remain, for the sake of our democracy, in its current Mitch McConnell-propagated form. Together in Filibuster, the two authors argue for a return to a modified version of the spoken filibuster, again, which was abolished in 1975, or rather modified. For the next 90 minutes, Mr. Zamore, now the National Policy and Government Affairs Director at the ACLU, will speak with us about his book and broader U.S. political circumstances with our moderator, Brown Democrat Speaker and Events Director and beloved community member. Thanks. There will be a brief period for audience Q&A towards the conclusion of our conversation. Mike, we are so thrilled to have you here.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm thrilled to be here too.
Thank you for
It's fun to be back. Thank you.
Yeah. What year did you graduate again?
93.
93, okay. So, not too long ago.
No, just the other day.
All right, so first question for you.
Yeah.
I know it's a vague, it's kind of a broad question, so take it in whatever direction you want. Can you provide us a brief overview of some of the arguments you make in your book?
Can't hear you.
So, you know what, let me... Is this on? Ooh, very on. Okay. Can you provide a brief overview of some of the arguments you make in your book? Particularly, what reforms would you like to see to the filibuster and why?
Yeah, sure. So Sam, thank you, and the Brown Dems and Watson for hosting. Thanks everybody for turning out. So as Sam mentioned, right, most of us are probably familiar with the idea that you need 60 votes to pass things in the Senate, right? So last week, the Senate had taken up a bipartisan negotiated compromise around immigration reforms that would go alongside Ukraine funding. Love the immigration reforms or hate them. It was something that a majority of the Senate was supportive of. There were 52 or 53 votes, I think, in favor of moving to that bill. And after a 53-47 vote, it failed. And, you know, we take that as sort of a sign of the way the Senate functions, right? The press reports it as it failed to get the necessary 60 votes. And but like unpacking what that means is you have a background rule in the United States Senate that basically says almost everything is subject to unlimited debate, which means that the thing that you're on the floor considering doesn't get a vote until all 100 senators agree it's time for a vote. Or, as Sam mentioned, there's this cloture rule that was created that allows a supermajority, currently 60, to say, look, we're done, we're ready for a vote. And that cloture rule was created as the tool to stop filibustering, right? So all 100 senators have to agree to get to a vote, but some of them won't get there and are just refusing to go along. So supermajority can say, time to finish. What's happened is that has become the de facto minimum now to actually get to a vote, right? Like you need 60 votes on, for example, a motion to proceed to a bipartisan compromise. For 20 years, like this has been the default, and we sort of treat it as normal. But when you stop and think about it, it's bananas that you require 60 votes in a 100 senator body to get to a final passage of a piece of legislation, right? Like if you were on a playground and you got the kids lined up and you said, okay, all the kids who want to play tag, stand to the right, and all the kids who want to play kickball, stand to the left, and there's more kids on the right, they're going to play tag. Like they know that basic fairness dictates that if more want to do tag, then that's what they do, right? That's common sense, and more importantly, that's the way the Constitution was designed, right? The Constitution was written in 1787 with a particular purpose, which was we need a federal government that can actually do stuff. So they thought about a supermajority requirement. They thought, hey, should we require 2/3 to pass stuff, make it hard? And they had one debate about it. One person raised his hand and said, yeah, I think that's a good idea. Everybody shot him down in the Constitutional Convention, and it was never heard from again. So Angus King, senator from Maine, liked to say when we were having lengthy debates with Joe Manchin about whether or not we should change the filibuster rules back in 2021, he said, the founders knew fractions. They specified 2/3 vote to ratify a constitutional amendment, for example, or to pass a constitutional amendment. They specified when you need 2/3 vote to impeach, to convict on impeachment and other things. They did not specify a 60 vote or a 2/3 vote to pass legislation. Why not? Because they knew it was a terrible idea, right? Hamilton and Madison wrote about it in the Federalist Papers. They wrote, Hamilton described it as the history of any body that requires a supermajority produces tedious delay and contemptible compromises. Like, it's a pretty good description of today's United States Senate. Instead, when the Congress first met, the Senate, very first Senate, got together. Remember, a lot of those people were actually the people who wrote the Constitution. Like, these are the founding generations, the founders with capital F. They created the precedents and the kind of operating system for the Senate to come. And they wrote into the rules certain things to make clear we want debate to move along and we want to get to the point and we want to have a vote. So there's a rule in there that says you can only speak twice on any given issue on a given day in the first rules of the Senate in 1790. There's Jefferson wrote a manual of parliamentary practice that that was adopted as an informal kind of background set of rules for the Senate, which said no one is to speak impertinently or beside the question, superfluously or tediously. So they wanted the Senate debate to move along. They were not in the camp of saying, oh, we should have indefinite speaking for as long as anybody wants to on any topic under the sun. And instead, what emerged in that very first Senate was something that we call in the book the Code. It's this social contract, really, that said every senator should get a chance to have their say, offer amendments if they've got them, debate those amendments, debate the bill, and then vote. Like, it's not that complicated a concept. Like, at the end of the day, obviously the Senate should vote. That's what we're here for. And obviously the vote should be a simple majority vote because that's what the Constitution anticipates. So that was the background rule for the Senate and how the Senate operated in that very first Congress. Kind of understanding that everybody has their opportunity to influence the legislation, to make their case, and then you call it. And that was basically the way the Senate operated for most of 200 years on most issues. There were exceptions, of course. The emergence of the filibuster, as Sam mentioned, in 1841. Slaveholding elite didn't like the bank bill that was on the floor. So they said, hey, we could actually abuse this rule or this kind of custom that allows everybody to speak as long as they want and just keep talking until it's done, until they give up. And and the filibuster was born. But the filibuster was an exception. It was a rare occasion that punctuated the basic norms of the Senate. It was obstruction for obstruction's sake, and as such, it was seen as piracy. It was the word filibuster is derived from a word meaning freeboot or pirate, because it was hijacking the Senate. It was completely beyond the pale of civilized society, and so that's the background history of the United States Senate, even into the 1990s. So the 1990s, to cite two examples, the partial birth abortion bill and the assault weapons ban, both of which super controversial, one on the left, one on the right. Neither of them ever got 60 votes in the Senate. Both passed. It was the understanding was you have robust debate and you have a simple majority vote. That has changed dramatically. And so as we know, now the norm is every single thing that passes the Senate, pretty much, of any substance certainly, requires 60 votes first. If you can't produce 60 votes, then you don't get to, that it doesn't move forward. What that means is the minority now effectively has a veto in the US Senate. The reason that we wrote this book and the reason that we think this issue is so important is that a minority veto, the mutually assured gridlock that produces, is amazingly corrosive to democracy. So we start the story of this book on January 6th of 2021 at the insurrection. I was across the street in the Senate Hart building that day. Senator Merkley was in the chamber, of course. And, that is the culmination of what happens when you feed 25 years of cynicism and sort of disillusionment to people. And the Senate has become a disillusionment factory. You can't pass, the members of the Senate cannot pass their agenda unless the minority says okay. So year after year, people are elected to Congress on an agenda. Presidents are elected saying they're going to push certain policies. Year after year, those things do not happen. The things that people want to see delivered by their government are not done. And so what conclusion do people draw? Like the government is, people are elected, they're winning elections, they're doing stuff, but obviously it's not the stuff we want. It's not for me. Like they're on the take, maybe, they're corrupt, they're inept. But whatever it is, like they're not there to do the business of the American people, clearly. Like people are not wrong to draw that conclusion, right? Like you look at all the long list of very, very popular bills that have gone nowhere. Assault weapons, or not the assault weapons, and the background check for gun sales, right? Negotiated by Joe Manchin and Pat Toomey, two like A+ NRA member representatives, had 54 votes in the Senate, failed. Climate legislation, LGBT rights, voting rights, the list goes on. Freedom, the Women's Health Protection Act to guarantee abortion rights. Like there's so many things that have, that the American public wants to see happen, wants to see delivered, that systematically are rejected. And so our solution that we propose basically is like it's imperative. It's imperative for our democracy that we restore the ability of the U.S. Senate to do the people's business and to deliver. And one option is just get rid of the filibuster, like just, do away with it. That's not actually our preferred solution because in the, what we have in the U.S. House of Representatives is basically the minority is a speed bump. And the Senate was designed, with different, a different idea in mind. And, like we can quibble with whether the Senate should exist or, whether it's a good idea. Obviously, it's really counter-majoritarian. But the role it has historically played with the huge and glaring and odious example of civil rights laws for much of its history was one where compromises were forged and negotiations were worked out on big thorny issues because the minority had a say and was able to influence the legislation, and at the very least was able to force things onto the agenda, make people vote on them, slow things up and like galvanize public attention on the questions of the day before a vote. And so our solution is bring that back, bring back the Senate of the code. People are not going to agree. Senators are not going to just do it out of the goodness of their heart. But let's restore a Senate where the minority has a voice but not a veto, where there's an opportunity to impact and influence legislation, or at least the legislative process. And then at the end of that process, you get a majority vote. And so if a very determined minority is going to stretch out a filibuster, so we recommend a talking filibuster as a way of doing this, to kind of bring back the talking filibuster, but ensure that it can be broken. That if the majority is determined and willing to wait it out, that they can get to a final vote. And if you do that, the minority has an incentive to compromise, knowing that at the end of the day, they will lose. And the majority has an incentive to compromise because filibusters are time consuming, and the most precious commodity of a majority is floor time. And if there's no agreement to be had, at the end of the day, if both parties are dug in and the minority is willing to take it as long as they can and the majority is willing to wait them out, the majority should prevail. Like, that's democracy. That's the playground, right? Like, that's how the Constitution is intended to work. And so that's that's how we would approach this. We would guarantee both sides amendments again to kind of ensure that there's a chance to, for the minority to kind of put issues on the table. But at the end of the day, our democracy is kind of withering for a bunch of reasons. And I don't mean that this is the only part of the problem or the only solution. But a big part of the explanation is that we have had 25 years now where the minority has a veto. And if the minority is in control, that's not democracy anymore. So that's kind of not very short, but shorter than reading the whole book explanation of what we're talking about here.
Great. Thank you so much. That was very comprehensive. I really appreciate it. I'm wondering, you spoke about this transition in the 90s from the filibuster being a third rail political position to being common practice in the Senate. Can you speak a little bit more to what forces created that new precedent?
Yeah. So to give people a sense of the scale, in the decade from 1955 to 1964, when the civil rights movement was in full flower and the Senate was the center of a lot of those conversations, there were 9 filibusters. In the 6 years that Mitch McConnell was minority leader and President Obama was in the White House, there were 643 filibusters. So what we have now is just materially different than anything that came before. And so we still use the word filibuster, but it's really a totally different situation. What happened, there's a lot of forces at play, right? And a lot has changed. One big inflection point was the 1975 rule change that Sam mentioned in his intro, when the rule was changed from it being 2/3 of anybody who voted to 3/5 of the senators who vote, whether or not they vote. What that meant in practice, and nobody really grasped at the time, was that the incentives around filibustering completely changed. So now, if you have a 59-0 vote on a cloture motion in favor of ending debate and having a final, passing a bill, that position loses, and the bill is dead, or you continue debating it. The minority no longer has to show up because not voting is the same as a no vote. The majority has to muster 60 votes in order to move a bill along, and that's a big burden on the majority and a piece of cake for the minority. So now what filibustering actually looks like now is senator has their staff person send an email to the cloakroom and say, my boss will object to a vote. And that's it. That's what a filibuster is today. We've seen the rules haven't really, the 1975 change was an important one, but mostly what's changed is less the rules and more the customs, right? That code that was in place starting in the very first Senate in 1790 that was kind of largely intact for much of the Senate history has completely been shredded now. It's completely gone. And things that used to be out of bounds became more acceptable. It started in many ways with the passage of the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act and some of the other bills in the late 60s. The Southern segregationists, having had 75 years of basically unfettered ability to filibuster and block legislation, finally got rolled. And it wasn't because, by the way, their filibuster got broken. It was because enough senators of both parties were willing to vote for cloture and overcome the filibuster. But when that happened, and happened in 64, it happened in 65, it happened in 68, the Fair Housing Act. The filibuster started losing its kind of racist taint. For much of the 20th century, as President Obama said, it was a Jim Crow legacy, right? It was used almost exclusively on civil rights bills. And so, filibustering was so closely associated with that segregationist wing of the Democratic Party that nobody else really went near it. And after kind of into the early 70s, that started falling away. There were a bunch of other things that have changed, changed our politics. The ideological sorting of the parties is a big part of this story. So you used to have conservative Democrats and progressive Republicans. So the parties didn't align closely with ideology the way they do now. That has made it much, much easier for sort of partisan stances to kind of get locked in. The media landscape has been hugely impactful on how politics work. All these things, and just our partisanship and polarization as a country. The Congress is reflecting what we look like as a country, where most people are now sorted into much tighter ideological partisan universes than they used to be, and so our politics reflect that. And the problems of our politics are not all created by, or would not all be solved by, dealing with the filibuster issue. But the filibuster is this incredible weapon in a hyper-partisan, hyper-polarized environment to break government. And so our argument is we got to take that kind of flamethrower out of our politics, and won't make everything better, but it will give us a better shot at addressing some of the other problems.
Great, thank you very much. Actually, just picking up on that last point, your book is titled "Filibustered: How to Save America," which is a hefty goal. And you've mentioned that we are in a hyper-polarized moment, and that's part of the reason that the filibuster could be weaponized in this way. So, beyond filibuster reform, what are some other ways that we can try to return to a competent democracy and a competent Congress?
Yeah, I think it's super important that we address and shore up the infrastructure of our democracy. So in 2021, the big fight that we kind of talked about in the book over what became the For the People Act, that was the vehicle by which we were trying our most recent attempt to address the filibuster rule, kind of centered on that bill. And what it would have done is address dark money in politics, created small dollar matching programs to try to take down the importance of big money and empower grassroots donors. It would have ended partisan gerrymandering and required every state to use nonpartisan commission type of line drawing for districts. Would have stopped all manner of voter suppression techniques that states are using, and really tried to move closer to the kind of ideal that every citizen who is eligible should be able to vote, which shouldn't be controversial, but now somehow is. And it also would have restored the Voting Rights Act, which has been gutted by the Supreme Court. And I think all of those things are really important. I think we need a functioning democracy that can deliver free and fair elections, and in a lot of places that is not particularly true at this point. So I think that's really important. And I think that, beyond that, I think there's interesting things worth exploring, like ranked choice voting, and especially ranked choice voting with the combination of open primaries, like they have in Alaska, has been sort of transformational of Alaska politics, as I understand it. I'm no Alaska political expert, but I've talked to people who are, and they say that it's really succeeded in marginalizing the MAGA Republicans, and in most districts now, there's an incentive to run towards the middle and kind of represent the median voter and not the extremes, and that's really transformed the way their political system has worked in state. I think that we have huge challenges that I don't have solutions to around our media environment, social media, the spread of disinformation, all of which obviously is going to be sort of supercharged by AI. I don't know the answer to that. Hopefully people in this room will figure it out because it's scary. And I think that in general, we have a challenge across kind of liberal democracies around the world of figuring out how democracies defend themselves against rising authoritarianism. The goal of authoritarians is to undermine confidence in institutions, and to undermine confidence in truth, and to get people to tune out. And so I think that we don't have all the answers on how to do that, but I do think a big part of it, is that we need a government that can actually deliver solutions that people are looking for. And that's why, even though there's all kinds of worries in the event that, if the filibuster were not an obstacle to passing things, and you can imagine a MAGA Republican trifecta doing really horrible things, and that's for a long time been people's reason not to do anything. It's like, well, what if? But I feel like right now we're in this environment where we are witnessing in perhaps in somewhat slow motion, but not even that slow. We're witnessing the shriveling of our democracy and our freedoms. And the basic idea of we the people government, and you think about the Constitution and those big words at the top of the document, like, it's supposed to be the government reflecting the values of the people and the preferences and priorities of the people. And if you have a minority veto in the United States Senate being exercised year after year, decade after decade, the promise of that document, the Constitution, is not being realized. And so people will turn their back on the Constitution, on the idea of democracy. And I think we're seeing that show up in polls, and you see that in the Trump's appeals for dictatorship and his flouting of norms is not a bug. It's a feature. Like, it is part of his appeal to a lot of people, because what it promises is, like, none of that stuff works, but I will get things done. And I think that's it's incredibly dangerous.
Yeah. Thank you very much. And speaking of reform, I know that campaign finance reform is something that both you and your former boss are very passionate about. Can you speak a little bit, as someone who has had experience working intimately in politics, what's the role of campaign funding in our elections, and how has that role changed? Has it gotten worse, considering recent, I guess not so recent, but developments in how campaign finance is structured in the past 30 years?
Yeah, it was transformed like sea change level changes by Citizens United, and not just Citizens United, but also the kind of willful disengagement from any kind of real meaningful enforcement of the idea of independent expenditure. So, you basically have members of Congress and senators and presidential candidates whose, best friend or longtime aide is running a super PAC. They can raise unlimited money from corporations or, billionaires or whomever. And, they share their campaign plans online, publicly, in a way that lets the, kind of them, kind of comply with whatever coordination rules exist because it's publicly available. But nobody really knows where to look for it usually. Although DeSantis did get burned by a whole trove of internal campaign documents showing up that way. But there's all kinds of de facto coordination that happens through these things. And so they're raising millions and millions of dollars from people who have lots of business before Congress. And that is obviously a huge conflict of interest. But even the old fashioned hard money form of fundraising is challenging and difficult. I have an old political mentor of mine who actually was a longtime Rhode Island state pol before he went to go work for Senator Kennedy. He was my first boss on the Hill. And he talked about how he was talking to a candidate running for office, and the candidate was like, I just keep hearing about the capital gains tax. It just seems like all anybody cares about. And he's like, who are you talking to? And, he was on the fundraising circuit trying to raise money for a race. And so he's at the country clubs and, the big dollar donor events trying to raise whatever the limit was then, $3,500 checks or whatever. And like, sure, those people care about the capital gains tax rate, but it's so warps the perspective. And I think we've seen Democrats, Republicans. I'm going to sound very partisan here. I hope nobody minds, but that's always been the Republican base. Like that's always been their priorities, right? But I think what we've seen among Democrats is a reluctance over the years to challenge certain kind of economic orthodoxies because they're dependent on it's not necessarily in a craven way, just that they're like dependent on the people who benefit from those orthodoxies. I'm thinking about Wall Street and the way we responded to the 2008 financial crisis, for example, but also because that's the people they're talking to all the time. So it goes back to that candidate running for office, right? People, Democrats and Republicans alike, are first of all drawn heavily from the millionaire, billionaire class because I sound like Bernie Sanders now. I'll try to say it with a Brooklyn accent next time. But it's hard to do this job and be a like middle class, let alone like blue collar working class person, because you need a residence in your home state and a residence in DC, and the job pays well relative to most professions in the United States, but it doesn't pay great compared to a lot of the alternatives, and so you get like really rich people who are friends with really rich people who are then talking to really rich people they're trying to raise money from, and it shapes how you see the world. So the campaign finance system is really problematic. I think Obama and in subsequent years sort of they brought the democratization, if you will, of fundraising on the left in particular, I've seen some of it on the right, has helped address some of that when it comes to hard money. But now the hard money is being dwarfed by the soft money, super PAC, independent expenditure stuff. So, it's bad. It's pretty corrosive.
Yeah. Thank you. And so going off of that a bit, you're now in the very exciting role doing policy and government work for the ACLU. So in your personal capacity or in your capacity in that job, beyond filibuster reform and other institutional changes, beyond campaign finance reform, are there any portions of the Democratic political agenda that you disagree with or that you wish Democrats would speak more to?
Yeah, I mean, I don't, off the top of my head, like there aren't a lot of portions of the agenda that I disagree with. What I disagree with is the way Democrats do or do not pursue the agenda. My theory of politics basically is if you're playing defense, the best you can hope for is a status quo. And there is no area of policy basically in our country right now where I think the status quo is good enough. I think you have to be on offense. Like you got to be looking to punch the other side in the face and change the conversation and set the terms of debate and expand, the Overton window of what's possible and move the conversation. And my beef with many Democrats is that the instinct very often is to kind of go into a defensive crouch and try not to get hit too hard. If it's any issue that seems controversial or that Republicans might attack you for, then put your head down and just don't talk about it. And I just think that's a recipe for losing slowly. And I want to be winning. I want to be changing the conversation and creating new opportunity and new policies to create change. And so I would like to see a much more assertive Democratic establishment. And I'd like to see people thinking about how we win the public conversation, even on the hard issues. And, when, like, for example, like trans justice issues right now, right? Like, so there are kids and families being absolutely terrorized in states right now. And for the most part, Democrats are trying not to talk about it because it's a complicated issue. People don't, a lot of people are like made uncomfortable by the idea of transgender people. A lot of people are really, conflicted and don't really know what to think about the idea of kids, and, making potentially like life-changing or permanent choices about, their bodies at that age and whatever. It's hard. And so most Democrats just don't talk about it. But the other side is still talking about it. Like whether we like it or not, they're going to have the conversation. And so either we seed the field and the framing of this, or we kind of tell our own story about, hey, who should be making these hard decisions? Should it be parents and medical professionals, or should it be politicians? Like that's not it's a conversation we can at least fight to a draw on, I think, if we have it. But we often choose not to have. Democratic, leaders and politicians often choose to avoid the issues that are not the ones they feel like they can win on, but it doesn't make that conversation go away. It just means you're going to de facto lose it. So I have less a problem with the Democratic agenda, which I'm largely on board with. Like I can't really think of a lot of examples where I'm like, oh no, they've got that one wrong. Right. But lots of issues with how we prosecute our politics, basically.
Awesome. Thank you very much. Moving away from not necessarily politics, but from your book for a second, there's a lot of Brown students in the room. I'm wondering if you could tell us a bit about your journey coming out of Brown through your present role, and if you have any advice for Brown students in general or advice for Brown students looking to get more involved in politics.
Sure. So I started here. I was a Russian studies and history major, and spent my first 3 years out of college over in Russia right after the fall of the Soviet Union. And when I went to Russia, my plan was I'm gonna go get a job on Capitol Hill. Like I was already by senior year, I had decided like I want to do this. Like this is what I'm interested in. But I also felt like I want to go and see Russia. I'd studied the language and the history and the politics and everything, so I want to go check it out. It was a great place to be. It was a fascinating time. I learned a ton and had a great time. And so like my first, based on that, one of my first pieces of advice is do the thing that's interesting and exciting to you right now, and don't get too hung up on the plan, because what you do may change the plan. So I mean, maybe some of you have somewhere you want to go. So okay, don't listen to me then. But for everybody else who's not quite sure, find something that's exciting and interesting and where you're going to learn and grow, and do that thing, and then see where it leads. I came back from Russia, went to law school, still thinking I wanted to do policy work. That was my goal, and I ended up spending my first summer during law school working for Senator Kennedy's committee staff for the Rhode Island Paul I was mentioning earlier. By the way, my favorite thing I learned from him was this: in politics, authenticity is everything, and when you learn to fake that, you've got it made. So that's Rhode Island politics right there for you. So I stayed. After I spent that, I had a great summer with him. It was really everything I was looking for. Finished law school, was clerking for a judge in New York. He called me up. We had stayed in touch. I had been, in DC for periodically. I would grab lunch with him or something, and he said, "Patrick Kennedy is looking for a policy person. You're the first person I thought of. Do you want to talk to him?" And I said, "Yes, I do want to talk to him." And I ended up working for him for 7 years. But the lesson in that one is that you got to stay in touch with people. The networking, especially to get into, I don't know about other fields, but in politics and policy stuff, the networking is super important. And stay in touch with people, have conversations. You never know who's going to be in a position later, which classmates, or you got to be sort of social and meet people and talk to them and keep relationships warm, and it can come in handy. So I ended up working in the House for 7 years with Patrick Kennedy, and then I did a stint in the 2008 election cycle at the Democratic Senatorial Campaign Committee, which is basically the campaign arm of the Senate Democratic leadership, trying to get Democrats elected. It was really interesting because I dabbled in the campaign side a little here and there, but didn't really know that universe. And I was working with some of the top campaign people in Democratic politics, and it was really a great education, really interesting. It was the 2008 election cycle when we elected a whole bunch of Democrats to the Senate, so that was super fun. By the time it was over, I was really ready to get back into the policy making side of things. Nobody in campaigns really cares about policy unless it's a means to an end to win votes. but I actually cared about what we did. So it was good to get back into the official side. And Senator Merkley had just won in that cycle. He'd beaten an incumbent, was looking to build a staff, hired me as his chief of staff to help do that. And I ended up staying for 14 years, contrary to my best guesses at the outset. But, an amazing place to be. The Senate is I mean, for all its flaws and dysfunction right now, it is an incredible institution and a perch to be involved in so many issues that matter to people's lives. And it was great. The staff was terrific. The senator was great. I learned so much. Kept learning the politics. The political environment would change, and so the job would sort of change. And it was only last year that I finally decided, you know what? Like I feel like I've seen the iterations now, and I'm ready for something different. One of the reasons I left was I wanted to be able to really zero in and focus on these issues of how do we save democracy, which it seems like it's teetering right now. The chief of staff job was amazing, but I was worrying one day about the county payments for Oregon counties, and another day about shellfish regulations, and then another day about like abortion rights. But it was so I was doing some of what I wanted to be doing, but a lot of the things that were not, like, to me, the most pressing issues of the day. And so like this is a chance now in this new role to be really zeroed in on how do we protect our rights and freedoms at a moment when they feel very precarious. And so that's been good. And in terms of getting a job, I think or just like pursuing things, in addition to the other kind of things I mentioned, I would just say that find the people, find the right people. And the person is more important than the job title or the institution, or sometimes even the issue. The people who are creative and driven and have a ton of initiative and are doers, and are kind and thoughtful, and like those are the people you want to be around. But there's so many people who just, they talk. They do a lot of talking, and sometimes it's really well-intentioned, and it's about like, what are the solutions and what should we be doing and how do we do it and how do we align things, and all that is like, there's value in that stuff. But like at the end of the day, like you got to stop talking, you got to start doing. And the world is kind of short of doers, turns out. So if you find somebody like that, you find people who are going to actually go out and like get things done and create solutions and work to, sort of change the world in ways that you're motivated and interested in, like clomb onto those people and learn from them, and co-conspire with them to do big things, and see where that takes you. So those would be my main pieces of advice.
Yeah, fantastic, thank you. And you just spoke a bit about how the role of chief of staff changed over those 14 impressive years where you did it. Can you speak a little bit about how you've seen our government and politics system change and how you responded to that change?
Yeah, I mean, things have certainly gotten more partisan and more sort of vitriolic over the years. I mean, I think every year at any given point you look back at the previous decade and think, oh, the good old days, probably. I never thought I'd say that about like Tom DeLay or something and running the House of Representatives, but like comparison, like George W. Bush was the good old days. Ugh. But yeah, so our politics have gotten a lot more complicated. I think that we've seen this. The Republican Party, I think, really pretty on mine. I guess Liz Cheney was supposed to be here tomorrow, but got snowed out. But there are so few Liz Cheneys out there. Like so few Republicans willing to stand up and actually be on the side of the rule of law and our constitutional values. And like I disagree with Liz Cheney on pretty much every single issue, except like, oh, the Constitution matters. But sadly, like there aren't very many like that anymore. So that is a radically different situation. I mean, we had I worked with Republicans earlier in my career who I disagreed wholeheartedly with, who I thought were like kind of corrosive to our politics or on the take or whatever, just like had the wrong values. But we never had like a situation where like they were overtly trying to overthrow elections. I I mean, Tom DeLay was trying to, redistrict in the middle of a decade because he could and like change the composition of the House, which I think was problematic. Newt Gingrich was, I think, incredibly damaging to our politics and our political culture. But I mean, even the Newt of the 90s, kind of believed in the basic fundamentals of democracy. He just was trying to like manipulate them to his ends, So like that's all different. And I think, we have seen our base, the Democratic base, also get radicalized, understandably, over, by the way things have evolved. And I think there's a lot less room right now for, kind of common sense solution oriented governing. And I detest the self-important moniker of like the problem solvers caucus in the House of Representatives. I just feel like, what do you think we're trying to do over here? Like, makes me so mad. But I do think that there's like not a lot of room in our politics right now for bridge building and it's interesting. Like I can have this conversation with Republican chiefs of staff. Like we get together and have very civil conversations about this stuff, but the political pressures are such that, there's not a lot of room for that. And so that combined with the way media has changed has I think really fundamentally changed the job of elected officials and consequently their chiefs of staff around how we communicate, the importance of being communicators versus being legislators. All that kind of stuff has really evolved as the politics have evolved.
Mm-hmm. Great. Thank you very much. Speaking of Republicans, the law, our Constitution, what are your thoughts on the Supreme Court case right now that's pending regarding Donald Trump's electoral viability? Or do you think it's a good thing that it made it to the Supreme Court? What do you think the outcome will be? I know that's a huge question, so you don't have to answer fully, but is it a good thing that this is happening?
I mean, look, it's not a good thing that the president of the United States tried to overthrow the election. Like, that's definitely a bad thing, engaged in insurrection. I think, I think that we are regularly, this is what I mean about the rising authoritarianism, but I think we are regularly confronted with bad options. And I think, I would be the first to say that reforming the filibuster the way we want to reform the filibuster to, in a way that I think is intentionally designed to try to be fair to the minority, so that it's fair to us when we're in the minority, and that is good for the long-term health of the Senate and the country. Like doing that by a partisan, simple majority tactic, I think is really problematic if all the Republicans are lined up against it. And I still think we should do it, but I don't think that, I think that plays into the increasing sense that, each side just manipulates the rules for their benefit. I think that that's, true also for in spades, if a state were able to throw a presidential candidate off the ballot, even if the Constitution prescribes that as the outcome. I think it's worrisome and dangerous. Is it more dangerous than letting a president try to orchestrate a coup and then remain a viable political candidate and president and give him the reins of power again? Probably not. But they're let's be clear, they're both bad outcomes. And so, it's kind of maddening that we are put in this position by the people who want to take down our democratic system of governance. And the fact that even if we fight them in any given battle and win, they may still be winning the war. I don't have an answer to that problem, though.
Yeah. Well, thank you for your insight. And before, again, close to that time, before I open it up to questions from the audience, I have one final question, and I think it's something that all of the Brown Democrats are wondering about. If you could speak a little bit to the disaffection of young voters, particularly young Democrats feeling like there are no good options in the upcoming election. If you could give those voters a piece of advice, some of your thoughts, and if you had the ear of Joe Biden, what might you say about running his campaign?
I think voters, young voters in particular, but I think all voters want to be inspired. Like people want hope. They want a vision that they can get behind. And, you know, the one of the problems of our political moment right now is that the politics are relentlessly negative. And I think, I mean, this goes back to what I was saying about sort of being on offense versus being on defense, right? The president's kind of whole reason for running and winning in 2020 and for running and hopefully winning in 2024 is going to be not that guy. And I wholeheartedly 100% agree with him. Not that guy is really, really an important outcome. And, you know, I might even believe that Joe Biden is sort of the best option for getting not that guy. But that's a hell of a not inspiring message. And I think that's really problematic. And I just don't think it's enough. I don't think it's enough to run on. I think that the president has a lot to, you know, he has a lot to talk about, like in terms of like what he's managed to do in the most difficult of political circumstances that nobody knows about, apparently. But, you know, he's got to tie it together, and he can tie it back to the you know, the kind of anti-Trump message, but he's got to present a vision that says, look, you know, I believe in a country and in America where like people have the right to like pursue their own vision of what their life should be. And they should be able to decide what name they're called. And they should be able to decide what pronoun they use. And they should be able to get an abortion if they want to and decide whether or not they're going to have a family tomorrow. They should be able to decide what book their kids read. And they should be able to go and earn a good living and not be taken to the cleaners by the boss who's driving around in the Lexus and flying in the private plane while, you know, quashing like a union organizing drive. Like there's so many things. There's a vision that he could like lay out that I think most people would agree with. I think that the president's positions are, I mean, obviously there's some exceptions, and you know, foreign policy is a different story, and I think he's got to pivot on that. But you know, but more fundamentally, like he's got to explain what he's for. I think all Democrats need Joe Biden to be able to explain the vision he has for why he wants to be president again. And if he does, I feel like at least that gives people something to, he's not going to be the best messenger of it. Like there's no question, right? Like for a whole bunch of reasons, but at least it gives other people a way to message around the cause. It gives people something to get interested and invested in. And I just worry that if you're just negative, if you're just essentially backwards, like let's not go backwards, like, you know, you're going to have trouble getting people to the polls.
Yeah. All right. Thank you for all of your wonderful, thoughtful responses to my questions so far. I'm going to open it up a little bit early to audience questions. And if you have to leave at the end of the hour, feel free to. We'll be going till 5:30. If anybody has a question, feel free to raise your hand. I'll just call. Yeah, go for it.
What are the practical kind of, what are the odds that this is able to happen?
Mm-hmm.
And more generally, do you feel optimistic about the future of the country, or do you think it's going to get worse before it gets better?
So in terms of like fixing the Senate, I think that there's a path to getting this done, for sure. The hardest part of it is going to be winning the Senate, holding the Senate in 2024 elections, November. But if we hold the Senate and win the House and hold the presidency, I mean, all of those things are hard. But if those things come together, I think that we actually have a reasonable shot at getting something done on the filibuster, because we had 48 senators vote in January of 2022 to change the filibuster rules for the Freedom to Vote Act. So they are on record. The senators who have come since and who will come and make up that majority all will have basically run saying things like the filibuster needs to change. And most importantly, I hope, is the imperative to deliver results will be, I hope, irresistible. And the result, the first and foremost, the result that will need to be delivered, because if we pull out a majority, it will be on the backs of abortion rights. It will be because of Dobbs and the energy that unleashed and people's insistence that we pass federal abortion protection so that your right to your own bodily autonomy doesn't depend on where you live. I hope that Democrats will not be able to hide behind the filibuster and like the fact that Republicans don't want to do that as a reason for not passing that bill. There's a lot that has to happen, including like consensus within the reproductive rights community about what that actually looks like, and obviously a vote to adjust the Senate rules accordingly and so forth. But I think that if we can get that trifecta, I don't think that's so out of reach. I'm certainly working towards it. I'm doing, organizing in meetings to try to create some political will and consensus around what filibuster reforms should look like and how those could get deployed. We're working with the reproductive rights advocates, the voting rights advocates, and others to make sure that they're carrying the message that, senators aren't going to be, Democratic senators cannot hide behind the Republicans don't want to do it as an excuse for not delivering results. So, knock on wood, like if we can win the elections, which is no small feat, we'll be in a position to get this done, working towards that. On your other question, can I answer that question in November? Because I think a lot depends on this upcoming election. And, I am very, very concerned about the prospect of Trump returning to the White House, but this time without anybody around him trying to slow him down, and with a playbook. I mean, I don't know if folks have heard about the Heritage Foundation's, playbook that they've written that basically is like all the ways that the Trump administration can MAGAfy the government and gut all of the, kind of protections and limitations. I think that it will be an extremely, extremely destructive period. I mean, in ways that could potentially put the 2017 to 2021 to shame if Trump is back in there. So if we can stave that off, I will feel much better.
Just a quick follow-up on that. Do you think that a Trump administration could legitimately follow through on some of those 2025 promises? And if so, what do you think are the ways in which that could occur? How do you see them gutting what they're calling the administrative state?
Yeah, I absolutely think they could do a lot of it. And I think that the courts right now are in a pretty rough spot to trust them as a bulwark. And I'm not certain that the next Trump administration would actually listen to the courts anyway. The things I think that are most worrisome is, I think the absolute politicization of DOJ. I mean, the idea that Jeff Sessions would be a profile in courage is like, I mean, it kind of makes my stomach turn a little. Like, I don't consider Jeff Sessions to be a good person at all, but at least, or Bob Barr for that matter, but like, at least they said no. If he puts in an attorney general who is game for completely politicizing the Department of Justice, that's a scary prospect. And I don't know about the evisceration of the civil service, but I would definitely not put that past them. And I think they'll have a lot of support. I mean, unlike the DOJ thing where there might be some reluctance in Congress and they might get some pushback, I think on politicizing the entire apparatus of the federal government and, getting rid of a lot of the experts and crippling the agencies for a generation, weaponizing the agencies. I think there's a lot of opportunity there for a Trump administration. So I think it could really be bad. One of the things I'm looking at right now and trying to explore in my new job at the ACLU is how we think about using the blue states as bulwarks in a more strategic way. You look at what the Republicans have done from state government and the way they have hijacked the entire political conversation in the country and around, for example, immigration by busing tens of thousands of migrants into blue cities. Even before Dobbs, the way that Texas bounty law essentially worked around Roe v. Wade. I mean, they've been really creative about using the state government to change the national political conversation, and I'm really interested in what opportunities might exist for us, not just to create little islands of, rights and freedoms in blue states, but to band blue states together to be thinking about how do they use their collective power to, kind of push back on a Republican administration. But, there's a lot to do. And it's, there is no substitute for the apparatus of the federal government, nothing like it. So the best outcome here, do not let them win. Like that's, so, yeah.
Fair enough. Any other questions in the audience?
I've got one.
Go
I'm
for
a
it.
Brown student, obviously, but I've.
That's not obvious.
You're very sweet. I'm baffled as to why the Democrats, and I've been around for 73 years and active politically my whole life, why the Democrats are such terrible messengers. You're right on so many issues, and we just can't get it across.
I know.
And I don't get it. I mean, it's just, we've been told, it's, why not? Do you have any hope for how we can improve our messaging so people actually understand that these MAGA folks, that the Republicans don't give a shit about them and that we do?
I don't have a pat answer on that. I have a piece of diagnosis, I think, of potential diagnosis of why this is the case. But, somebody pointed out to me recently that Democrats are inherently like grassroots bottom up like orientation. And so like we've got Republicans are they're so like hierarchical in terms of how they organize themselves. And so they pull together like a Koch brother, kind of donor conference thing and give the marching orders. And it, kind of sticks. They had for years, Grover Norquist was a anti-tax zealot advocate person and had a Tuesday morning meeting for all the Republican allied groups. I mean, many of which had nothing to do with tax policy. And they would have like their weekly talking points. And they kind of all stick to it. Democrats get talking points and they throw them in the trash and they say, this is what I'm going to talk about today. Every Democrat, thinks that they're like the perfect messenger. All the groups have their own priorities. We're just, we're a more fractious, I think, more consensus-y, deliberative group. And I think it manifests in a lot of lowest common denominator kind of messaging that's like, well, we have to mention everybody's thing so that, because if we don't mention this issue, then they'll get mad. If we don't mention that issue, then they'll get mad. And, so it's like we wind up with the, it's kind of like you put all the colors in and it's just brown. And I think that's, a frequent problem. And I don't know what the solution is. I don't think there's a good one. I mean, I think what we really need is a very good communicator at the top of the ticket who kind of everybody falls in line behind, which, or Barack Obama in 2008. Like he was really, really good. And when people see it working, then they draft behind that, you know what I mean? But,
He hardly got anything done either.
well, yeah. And he didn't message on it very well once he was in office, right? So, yeah. Yeah.
Did you have a question?
Yeah,
go for it.
So you were talking about like changing the Senate rules to bring back talking filibuster. What do you think some of the like side effects or like how that could be hijacked later down the line to do bad things?
Yeah. So I think there's a bunch of different side effects that would happen. Some of them are I think, great. Like, for example, there's all kinds of not very controversial stuff that the Senate still, like, never gets to the Senate floor because the minority threatens a filibuster. And even if it would pass, even if you could get 60 votes to pass it, the majority is not willing to spend the time. Because if filibuster was rare, the cloture process was intended to be used rarely, and it's time consuming. It takes like 3 to 5 days basically to deal with a filibuster and invoke cloture. And on a piece of legislation, you can filibuster the motion to proceed to the bill. So it's like debating whether to debate the bill. And then if there's an amendment on the bill, which there often is, to a substitute amendment or something that kind of like repackages or fixes it or whatever, like that's subject to a filibuster and then needs cloture. And then you need cloture to finish the bill. So that's potentially 3 cloture votes. If you have 3 cloture votes on a bill, that's at least a week, probably more. So there's all kinds of like low grade kind of stuff. There was a bill, energy efficiency, bipartisan energy efficiency bill that took 8 years to pass, Gene Shaheen and Rob Portman, because it kept getting filibustered and it was just like they weren't willing to put the floor time into it. And so, that's the kind of thing that if these rules were in place, like nobody's staying through the weekend to keep talking to block the energy efficiency bill. I think there's a lot. I think one of the byproducts is like you'd see a lot more things reach the floor and get done, which is great because like one of the unseen results of the current status quo is that so little legislating gets done that when there is a big package that's going to move, like the annual appropriations bills or something, tons of stuff gets dumped in there because it's the only train leaving the station. And so that's perfect recipe for special interest backroom deals. And you see all kinds of stuff get dumped into those bills that would never survive the light of day. And so getting things back into some semblance of regular order and more routine legislating, I think would be really good for all, for the specifics of those things and for the big picture showing that government can work and for, helping to democratize and shine some light and transparency. The downside risk, obviously, is that if Democrats or the progressive majority were able to wait out the Republicans and do some of the things that they detest but we think are super important, they could also do the same thing to us. And what would that look like? And I think it's a real concern. And there's no question that we could all imagine things that we would be very, very happy to have filibustered. So I don't minimize that risk. I will say that our ability to legislate, I think for Democrats is, I think that a mutually assured gridlock like we have right now is inherently to our detriment because Democrats are the party of government. Like we're the ones who want to do stuff. So whether you want gun safety legislation or, LGBT rights legislated or reforming the Voting Rights Act or, whatever, climate legislation, abortion rights, like all those things right now require 60 votes. And if we, what they want to do is essentially gut the administrative state, which they can do if they just have the presidency or, kind of control the appropriations process, or they can, they want to confirm judges, which they can now do by simple majority because of rules changes in the past, or pass tax cuts, which they can do because of rule changes in the past, all, with simple majorities. So I feel like, there's bad outcomes to be had here. But in the end, I feel like the worst outcome is the status quo, which is corroding our democracy and preventing a ton of important things from getting accomplished.
Mm-hmm.
If there were more trains leaving the station, wouldn't that attract more lobbyists to fill up the cars of those trains?
Yeah, but
Because I think that you're right, that Democrats want to do a lot of things that are good from a public policy. Republicans want to do a lot of things too under cover of darkness, and that wouldn't that influence a lot more lobbying activity on an open thing, and maybe that could be controlled.
Yeah, I mean, so in 1975, Congress debated a tax reform law, and it was on the floor for 3 or 4 weeks, I think. There were 125 votes on that bill, most of which were amendment votes, and they were specific things like, let's get rid of this tax break for this thing, or let's expand this tax break. 125 votes, all of them simple majority, by the way. And, but that transparency, that accountability that came with each of those votes meant that these things were not happening in a back room. On, the appropriations bills passed last year, they were on the floor for 1 day or 3 days by the time we did the cloture votes. There were no amendment votes, or maybe there were 2 Rand Paul votes, show votes. The whole thing was written in the back room. Jeff Merkley has a story about, we get burned on these things. Sometimes you find out afterwards what's in them. He asked Barbara Mikulski, who was the appropriations chair at the time, she was in a caucus meeting touting all the great things that were in the bill that they were going to be asked to vote for. And Jeff said after the meeting, so Barbara, what are the things in this that we're going to hate? because I know there's a ton of great stuff, but like there's also going to be things we don't like, right? Like what are they? And she was like, I'm not telling you, that's not how this works. and that's the thing, like you've got like a 1,500-page bill, and they're written often in ways that like you can't really tell what these provisions do. You have to chase each one down back to the U.S. code and see what it's amending, and so they're designed to be obfuscatory. And I think if you had a regular order bill on the floor, opportunity to offer amendments and like call out provisions, time to slow things down and actually or threaten to slow things down to find out what's in the bill or to get, it just gives you more leverage and tools to bring transparency to the process. Because, there's always going to be lobbyists sneaking stuff in. Like that's going to go with the territory for sure. But the bigger the bill and the fewer people who are involved in writing it, the more opportunities exist. And right now we have that's kind of the perennial work product of the Congress.
Any other questions right now? Go for it.
Hi. Yeah, I had a question because I know you had mentioned like ranked choice voting in Alaska earlier, and how it was helpful because it essentially like led to more candidates being more moderate. My question related to the filibuster is, by getting rid of it, wouldn't you kind of be doing the opposite? Because you're basically like getting rid of any incentive to be bipartisan, to cooperate, since you can just like win by a majority. Because like I feel like I'm thinking now, with the filibuster in place, the Senate is still more cooperative, more bipartisan than the House is. And then like furthermore, like you mentioned in like the last question about Republicans focus on judges. I feel like they've been able to put in more partisan judges, largely because of the nuclear option in 2013 led by the Democrats.
Yeah.
So don't you worry that, getting rid of filibuster is just going to like emphasize partisanship even more?
Yeah, I think that is a real concern, and it's the kind of strongest epithet in the Senate is U.S. House of Representatives. People do not, the thing you hear all the time from the senators is we don't want to become the House, and I think that's right. I think that in the House, the minority is a speed bump. Like you don't get to actually impact the process. I think you're right about the extremism of some of the nominees since the nuclear option got passed. But I also think if you look at the Senate of today, it's hard to argue that bipartisanship is breaking out all over the place. So in theory, yeah, the filibuster, the requirement to get 60 votes to get something done creates the opportunity at least to use leverage to force bipartisanship. But really practically what it does almost all the time is just give the minority the opportunity to obstruct. So the difference is, and what we're looking to do, what the book recommends is we want to restore the incentives on both sides to come together and negotiate. Like that's what made the Senate kind of the quote unquote world's greatest deliberative body, was that when the code was in place, when it was the understanding was both sides will have the opportunity to kind of have it out on the floor, and this could take a long time, and this could mean a lot of painful votes, politically and potentially physically, that there was reason to work it out. But in the end, the incentive was the leverage that the minority was afforded was used to shape the legislation. Now, almost always, the incentive is used to block the legislation. And that's the problem. So in the Gingrich Revolution kind of taught both sides really that obstruction is a key tool of advocating for a change of leadership. And the way you make the case that you should throw the bums out and put us in power is make sure that the bums don't deliver anything. And if you help them work out a compromise that solves a problem, that is, that undermines the case for changing leadership. So Gingrich brought that mindset to the House. McConnell had that mindset, but he had this superpower of being able to actually stop the majority from doing anything. So Gingrich went to the House floor and railed against the Democrats and didn't help and said how terrible they were and ginned up scandals and stuff like that. But that's all he really could do. McConnell could actually stop the Senate in its tracks and did. And so when McConnell said in the first term of the Obama administration, our primary goal here is to make Obama a one-term president, he had the perfect tool at his disposal to do so. And I think that, yes, like getting rid of the filibuster altogether would produce a different set of harms, and that's not my first choice. It is my, like, if I had to choose between a perennially 60-vote Senate and a perennially majority Senate, I would pick majority for sure. I mean, I just think that's democracy, and like we gotta like show people what members stand for and have votes and elect them. But I would rather have a situation where there is a rationale for slowing things down, where the minority has a chance to at least shape the legislation and has the leverage to kind of try to draw out some compromises and create maybe some legislative, products that are longer lasting with a broader base of support. But that's not what the current situation gives us.
Thank you. Any more questions from the audience? I've got one more. So earlier you mentioned how a lot of Republican states use their power as a state to kind of, for national purposes, right? I know that I, as a New Yorker, often feel like I'm, federally ineffective as just one little blue voter. So you mentioned that in your new role, you're trying to think of some ways that blue states can employ those same strategies. I know that you're somewhat new to the role, so maybe you haven't fully thought them out yet, but off the top of your head, what can blue states do to have a federal impact?
I don't have all the answers right now. I mean, I think that what would be beneficial is some strategic alignment around how blue states are using their economic and political power. I mean, one thing to remember is, there are, I can't remember now exactly the numbers, there's something like 19 or 23 Republican trifecta states where they're all government's all red, and some smaller number of blue states, maybe like 14 or something like that. But the blue states have over half of all, kind of budgets of, state budgets, and nearly half of the economic output of the country. Like, blue states have a lot of power there, and I don't have the answers off the top of my head about how we do this, but I do think that if blue states had a mechanism to be thinking and talking strategically about how they approach some of the problems, if we had a way to better, so think about how in a red, if one bad idea in one red state just spreads like wildfire and suddenly like every state is doing it, like we don't really have those mechanisms very well established on the progressive side, and I think creating some infrastructure that allows blue states to kind of operate more in concert, at the very least, would create opportunities to, kind of shape the national conversation in a different way. So I feel like that's at least a place to start.
Great. Yeah, go for it now.
I have a question about kind of, as I know a lot of underclassmen are starting to think about their internship hunts and looking for jobs, it sometimes feels like my conservative friends, and they do exist at Brown, rely a lot on like kind of what we kind of coined the conservative welfare state of internship, which is like they go to the Hudson Institute or they go to Heritage Foundation, and they're basically all of these different programs and institutes and all of these different things lining up, chomping at the bit for these smart young conservatives from these like prestigious institutions to come and work for them. And I'm now a senior, so I'm not looking for a summer internship, but I never encountered that when I was applying for jobs. And you talking about for different states interacting in those kind of mechanisms, I guess I was just wondering, where is that? Where is that foundation for laying the ground for young people to come engage in politics and policy in Washington on a liberal perspective? And I wonder if you could speak to that more. Where is the ACLU's welfare state?
Yeah. I mean, I don't think that we have it in the same way. I think part of the reason that the conservatives do is because they feel beleaguered in higher ed and sort of these kinds of settings, and so they like kind of circle the wagons a little bit and are excited to like cultivate and nurture their talent. There's, I mean, frankly speaking, like I think there's a lot more of you than there are of them, but also our organizations are less, it's like we're less likely to engage in there's a lot of appropriately emphasis on equity and process and fairness, and there's not like a lot of hand picking, cherry picking, like, oh, the professor has the in with the thing and sends the list, and that's the way they do their judicial clerkships too and stuff like that. And I just don't think, I think that we tend to be operate a little bit differently on that. There's so many groups in the progressive democratic ecosystem, and there's like a lot of places, and I assume they all have, a lot of them have internships, but we definitely do not have, to my knowledge, like a particularly good funnel. There are some things, I don't know about for internships, but for staffing that have been created to try to create mechanisms to cultivate and sort of vet and help channel staff into progressive offices and organizations and things like that. I'm not sure how successful they've been, but I know that some of that stuff is out there. But I don't. It's a good question.
Anyone else in the audience? Okay, barring any other questions, I think I'm going to wrap this up a little bit early, let you all go home and make your snow day preparations, but if you just join me one more time in thanking Mr. Zamore. Thank you all for coming. Oh, and we have an event this Thursday. Noah, what time?
7 p.m.
7 p.m. Brown Dems internship event. Speaking of the opportunities for internships in democratic politics. So if you're interested in that at all, please feel free to come by.